This is the Great North Wrestling Podcast, the official podcast of the Hannibal TV, Canada's #1 pro wrestling YouTube channel, with your host, three-time Canadian champion and GNW lead reporter, Devin Hannibal Nicholson.
This is Hannibal from thehannibaltv.com, and right now on the line I have former WCW, AWA, and WWE announcer. He's also an author of one of the first professional wrestling behind-the-scenes books out there. Gary Michael Capetta, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing really well, thank you. I'm between stage shows, and I'm really happy to be available to talk to you today.
And you talked to us actually 2 years ago when we were at WrestleCon, and David Penzer was doing interviews for us, and you mentioned your stage show in that interview, and I understand it's still going well. To start it off, do you want to talk a little bit about your stage show and where people can find out more about them?
Sure. What I do is I take some of the most, the funniest, sometimes the most outrageous, the most interesting stories from my Body Slams book, and I go beyond. So I'll tell stories and use rare video footage. So while I'm telling the stories, you're watching the video. This edition, I'm going back to cities where I've been before, so it's a brand new show. This one, I'm on the road with Steve Austin in Texas, and with The Undertaker when he was Mark Calloway in WCW. We were on the road together for a week in the Midwest at a time that was kind of critical in his career. And he had a beef with one of the headliners in WCW who had screwed him out of a bunch of money years before. And so, you know, I talk about our conversation about that, because he wanted to get violent with this guy. It was pretty tense for a week. And I have upcoming shows in Chicago on September 21st. I have Pittsburgh, October 6th, and I'll be at WrestleCade in Winston-Salem, North Carolina on November 23rd. In Chicago on the 21st of September, I have Brian Pillman Jr. with me to kind of talk a little bit about his dad, which ties into my WCW years, and also we'll find out what's going on with him and his wrestling career. And then October 6th, and this was just happenstance, in Pittsburgh, that's Bruno Sammartino's birthday. And Bruno was instrumental in my career, so we'll celebrate his birthday there. And then, of course, there'll be dozens of wrestlers at WrestleCade in November. So I have a good time. You know, we just go out and I tell a bunch of stories. It's a 2-hour set piece. And then at the end, as an encore, we do a question and answer. So I answer any questions that the folks have. No holds barred.
Do you have any clue for us that won't be able to make the show who the wrestler was that The Undertaker had the beef with in WCW?
Yeah, I can tell you. It's Buzz Sawyer.
Okay.
Yeah, Buzz Sawyer had... I can tell you a little bit of the story. Just, you know, as if this was a wrestling match and we're leading up to the match. I just can't tell you the finish.
Right. Well, we've had some other people talk about Buzz Sawyer on this YouTube channel, and we know he's kind of a crazy individual legitimately.
Yeah, he was to train Mark Calloway, Undertaker. It took a bunch of money from a bunch of students in Texas, and they got maybe a lesson or two, and all of a sudden he disappeared. And I mean, we know now that he went off to California, but he left these guys high and dry. And at that point in his life, the money that Mark Calloway had paid him, he had borrowed from his brother. It was a lot of money for him at the time. So caused a lot of hardship in his life, and he was intent on getting his hands on, and he was the headliner. So, and Mark Calloway, this was his first week on the road in WCW. I mean, he was a newbie. So and Ole Anderson was the booker in WCW, which is why Buzz Sawyer was the headliner. Just their history. So it was a week of more or less counseling. To tell the guy, look, if you put your hands on him, if you do anything, you're going to be gone, not him. It doesn't matter who is right. And it all culminates in Cincinnati when they come face to face with me in the middle. So that's the setup for the story.
In those days, would you have ever imagined that The Undertaker would have ended up having the success that he had in the business, that he still has, I guess? He's still wrestling.
Well, I knew that he was extremely talented. I knew that, yes, that no one could imagine the success of one of the most iconic figures in the history of pro wrestling. But yeah, his athleticism was through the roof. What his shortcoming was, and early on in his career, was an inability to emote. So you'd watch the guy wrestle, and his face was kind of like blank. He didn't tell us anything. So what better role could there be than a dead man? So, but of course, there was no vision in WCW for such a thing, and good for him. That he went on to become one of the most iconic figures and characters in all of pro wrestling.
And you mentioned that you used to travel with Steve Austin. I have to ask you which character you liked better, Stunning Steve Austin or Stone Cold Steve Austin?
Oh boy, the guy's so talented, he just could pull off anything. I really don't have a favorite. I mean, I like them both. She was just so effective. And it was interesting because he was in very different places in his life and very different places in his career. Once again, WCW was his first international stage. To watch him with Brian Pillman, and that tag team was just terrific. But remember, when he left and he went to WWF at the time, there wasn't much of a vision for him because he came in as the ringmaster. So that, Stone Cold evolved, and thank goodness for all of us that it did.
And I'm sure you probably agree with most of us that WCW really dropped the ball on that Hollywood Blondes tag team of Austin and Pillman.
Oh, absolutely. They dropped the ball on a lot of things. I was there 89 through 95, through May of 95. So I preceded the Nitro era. So yeah, there was a lot of ball dropping.
And I've heard you say in some interviews that part of the reason why you left WCW had to do with them bringing in Michael Buffer for some massive amounts of money. Is it true that was one of the main reasons, or was it mostly due to them having budget cuts like it says on your Wikipedia?
Michael Buffer had nothing to do, from my side of things, with me leaving. It was, I just think Eric Bischoff wanted to shuffle the cards, and it was time to move on. You'd have to ask him as to what his thought process was. He probably thought I was too expensive, but he never negotiated in good faith. So if that was the case, I wasn't told. It was just a matter of, thank you for your service, and we're going to move on. Okay. And, too often I hear, in the entertainment business, when you have a contract to perform, it's not guaranteed for life. So, there's no bitterness. It was just time to move on. And, if I didn't, there'd never be a Body Slams book, and there'd never be a Body Slam show, and I wouldn't have had other opportunities to do other things. So I totally respect, the promoter's prerogative to change gears.
Do you think when they were bringing in Michael Buffer for those, I guess they ended up using him a lot for Nitros down the road, but they started off using him for pay-per-views and I think Clash of Champions specials. Do you think that was worth whatever they were paying him at the time, or is that one of the costs that they probably could have saved a little bit on to help stay out of the red?
Um, they brought him in for a reason. I mean, we were both ring announcers, but we had very different roles. I was the nitty-gritty, day-to-day, on-the-road house show guy, and did the WCW Worldwide and WCW Saturday Night show, so it's a syndicated show and the main TBS show. And Michael came in for, special events, only announced the main event of those special events. So we had very different roles. It was Dave Penzer that took on my assignment. It wasn't Michael Buffer. So he had, nothing to do with that. I would say, to answer your question, that Eric had and I don't know what it is because you'd have to ask him, but he had a certain vision in mind where he thought that Michael Buffer would bring more eyes to the product. He probably did, but I don't know. And if they did any kind of market analysis as to if that was the case, then I assume that they felt that their investment was worth it.
And being the house show announcer, I guess you were on the various international tours that WCW did, and I understand you were on that infamous tour where Arn Anderson and Sid had their altercation, which Sid has talked to us about.
Yeah, there's a background to that, which started in the States, where we had done a special event. I guess it was a pay-per-view on a weekend, and then we were herded on a plane over to the United Kingdom, did not land in the city where we were performing. They put us on a bus. We got in just in time for that show. We weren't staying after the show. We weren't staying in that city. We had another 3-hour ride on buses. By the time we got to that hotel, everybody was totally like bleary-eyed, and you add a little liquor to that. I mean, the promoter was a top-notch concert promoter, was used to catering to rock stars. He had the buses well stocked with with beer and stuff. And so by the time we got to that hotel, little sleep, everybody's tired, alcohol. It was just like a perfect storm for a kaboom, to a combustible kind of circumstance.
So were you, I guess you probably didn't witness it, you were probably in your hotel room and you saw, I guess, the aftermath of the situation.
Well, I ear-witnessed it. Arn's room was across the hall from mine. So when they had their spat down in the bar and the head of security, Doug Dellinger, sent everybody back to their room, Arn went to his room. Sid's room was on the other side of the hotel. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think he picked up a chair and searched out Arn. Now, how can you search out somebody in a hotel room at 2 in the morning? Well, we were given itineraries when we got there, and everybody knew where everybody's room was because, you just followed. Okay, Gary Capetta is in room 106, Arn's in room 108, or whatever it was. So I heard the whole thing. I was almost asleep, and I heard the kabooms, out in the walls pounding, the wall decorations and pictures on the wall shaking as the guys were throwing each other into the other side of the wall from my room. So I almost went out to find out what was going on, and luckily I didn't in the middle of it. And then, of course, I witnessed the aftermath with Vader and Scorpio.
And speaking of Vader, he passed away recently. We were lucky enough for the Hannibal TV. We did a career interview with him shortly before he passed. But just wondering what your memories are of Vader, and I guess you were there for the infamous incident where he accidentally knocked off Cactus Jack's ear.
Yeah. Um, that's another story with a backstory where when Mick Foley entered the ring that night in Munich, Germany, it was part of a tournament, and he did not enter the ring with a healthy ear. I mean, his ears were hanging off from months and months of abuse of doing that the one move where he inserts his head between the center and top rope from inside the ring, and then launches himself over, and so he's pretty much hung up in the ropes with the ropes tangled around his neck, and the referees would open up the ropes and he would go through and fall to the floor. But each time he did that, his ear was nicked little by little by little. So he was taping his ears down to the side of his head by the time we got to Europe. So that was just the final, the final coup de grace of that, of his ear. And it was not a televised event, but there was a German fan in the audience who had a camcorder. And I have the footage of the match, and I've used it in my stage show to tell the story, where you see the incident where he goes over. We had a French referee who had never worked with the promotion before, didn't know what he was supposed to do. We had a ring crew that was European that had tightened the ropes to a point where you had a referee who didn't know to pull the ropes apart if he could, ropes that were extra tight, and so when Mick went through, it was the final straw for that ear. And when he got back in and he got slugged in the side of the head, the ear flew off. And so you see that on this tape that I bring around and show at the shows, at my Body Slam shows. And then the referee picked it up and brought it over to me. And I didn't exactly know what he was doing because he didn't speak English. He was a French referee. And I did understand the word ambulance. He was screaming, ambulance, ambulance. So when I realized that I was holding Mick's ear, I brought it backstage, and Ric Flair was in charge that night. And before I could get the ear on ice, I had to convince Rick that I was serious when I said I had Cactus's ear in my hand. It was very dark backstage. So I had to, and he knew that I would never leave ringside during a match. And that confused him to begin with. Like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be out there. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole story that I tell once in a while in my stage show about what happened when I brought the ear back to Flair and Sting saw it, because I knew that if there was any chance for us to salvage the ear, we'd have to get it on ice, and the only one that had ice in the back was the doctor, and that's the guy I was searching for. So I was in the middle of that one. I mind my own business, and look what happens.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting situation, to say the least. For Ric Flair, I'm guessing you had a lot of contact with him over the years. Any unique stories on him?
I always had great respect for his professionalism. He actually was responsible for an extension of my contract with WCW, where they were going to let me go a year before, and I had nothing to do with it, and I only learned about it afterwards. That Rick went to Eric Bischoff and said, "You can't get rid of this guy. Like, he's really loyal, and he's a steady Eddie kind of guy. He's always there for us." So we had mutual respect, and it was always fun when you were around Rick. But when it came to entering the ring, he was all business, and I don't mean that. I mean that in the best way of being sure that fans got their money's worth.
And what's your favorite match that you've witnessed in all your years as a ring announcer? Is there anyone that stands out?
Well, I usually don't have an answer for... I've been involved in pro wrestling for 44 years. So I usually don't have an answer for the best, the most, the least, the worst, that kind of thing. But in this case, I narrow it down to two. There were two rivalries that spanned 3 matches, so they were like a 3-match series. One was in the 70s, 80s, and that was Superstar Billy Graham as a WWF champion defending his title against Bruno Sammartino, who came back for his title, who came back looking for his title. And this, at the time, I was the announcer at the Philadelphia Spectrum, and we sold out the Spectrum 3 months in a row. That was really an exciting series of matches. And then fast forward to the 80s, 90s, it would be the Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat trio of matches that spanned over pay-per-views and a Clash of Champions. You just knew as that was happening that it was special and historically important.
And you bring up that Superstar Billy Graham match. We've actually done numerous interviews with him, and he's a close friend of mine. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on him as like a wrestling icon and his role in the history of wrestling, because there were so many people that took elements of his gimmick over the years, and he also, I think he holds the record for most consecutive sellouts at Madison Square Garden. Obviously, he had numerous sellouts in Philadelphia. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about him.
Well, in the territory days, when I worked exclusively for the McMahons, and I worked for the McMahons for 11 years, from 74 to 85, we had never seen anyone like him. Not only the charisma, but the color, the colorful guy, with the tie-dyed and the jewelry, and when my book first came out, he was the first. He took the time. I don't know how he found my address, but he took the time to find my address and write me a nice note about my book, which I was overwhelmed. At the time when I worked with the WWF, it wasn't a full-time thing. I was teaching school, so I didn't get an opportunity to socialize with the wrestlers during those years. And so therefore I didn't, we weren't buddies. We never went out for dinner together. And for him to take the time to congratulate me on the book and tell me how much he liked it was, I have that letter to today. It was very special to me. So, I only have the highest of praises for him. Another series of matches that was really cool, also at the Spectrum. When I say at the Spectrum, it ran its course through Madison Square Garden in Boston and Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., but I witnessed them in Philadelphia, was when Dusty Rhodes came in, and they had a series of matches, and I particularly remember a bull rope match. It was just electric. It was just great stuff.
What do you think of Dusty's son Cody's recent success since leaving WWE, and they recently had that large crowd with that All In show?
I'm thrilled. I call it a step toward the democratization, equalization between performer and promoter. It's amazing the power that the Bucks and Cody and Kenny Omega have, where they can call their own shots, where in their future, WWE may be knocking on their door and they may be saying no thanks. Unheard of. I think in the history of American wrestling, of the more modern era. Okay, so I'm kind of like narrowing it down a bit. I think if you look at Stan Hansen, Abdul the Butcher, they were individuals who were independent, truly independent wrestlers in the States because they made their money in Japan. So this is, other than those isolated incidents or comparisons, I don't know. This has never been done before. I think it's a very exciting time. I am very careful about the evolution of anything that I love. I just sort of think of myself as some people call me an old grouch, and I'll call myself a gatekeeper of the basics of pro wrestling, because I've seen other art forms go away when they get too far away from what made their core. So that we just need to remember that pro wrestling is two guys. This sounds so like basically dumb, but if we can remember that pro wrestling is two guys entering, or two opponents, two teams, two women entering a ring, and the idea is to win a match. There's so much of wrestling that I see that where the actions in and out of the ring don't contribute to that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I understand that.
I don't want pro wrestling to go the way of Ringling Brothers, that got away from what made them great in their core. Just as an example, you can look at drum and bugle corps competitions. I mean, you can roller derby. I want pro wrestling to remain healthy, and I want the current performers, who are athletes like we've never seen before as a body of athletes. They're the best that I've ever seen. I want them to understand that they're blessed to have the spotlight, that they've been the spotlight is shown on them when the industry is somewhat healthy, and that they need to leave the sport as healthy as when they found it in 15, 20 years when they leave it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And hopefully that does happen.
Well, I'm not satisfied in just sitting back and saying, I hope it happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I am looking, and a lot of the younger folks, I mean, they weren't even born the last time I was on any kind of major TV, so they have no idea who I am. But I still feel the need to speak out when I see the sport stray from its core.
And another person that has, I guess, similar view to you on that is Jim Cornette, who I understand you're friends with. Was he always as outspoken and as temperamental as he is now, or has it increased with his age?
No, Jimmy's been Jimmy. But I think that we're a bit different. I'm a bit more open to the evolution of the sport. I have and put Jimmy aside because I'm not talking about Jimmy. I'm mostly talking about a lot of people who follow my Facebook page, for instance, are like holding on to the past, and I think that's wonderful. Part of my stage show has been asking the audience, what brought you to pro wrestling? Like, how did you find this? And 9 times out of 10, they refer to a relative or a good friend. So their love with pro wrestling goes beyond the event. It has to do with an interconnection with people that they love, not just an activity that they love. So I understand holding dear those memories. But a lot of old-timers conveniently forget the Mummy, conveniently forget wrestling bears, a lot of schlock that happened in the past. They had their place on the card. They were special attractions. But it always existed, the bizarre. It was just easier to explain away, I think, since, people weren't smart back then, to the business.
Right.
It becomes more difficult today. It becomes more difficult to gain, the Cody Aldis match. The NWA has done a terrific job in creating an atmosphere of believability around that 10 pounds of gold. It can be done. It still can be done. You can still take people and take them on a ride. Unfortunately, it's just for the time that match is occurring. And then afterward, everybody has their smart opinion about what happened and their constant analysis. I think folks sometimes overanalyze things. In a way, they know too much so that they can't sit back and enjoy the sport viscerally. And I think that's unfortunate. But it is what it is. I mean, there's no going back.
And you worked for, I guess, WWE when Vince McMahon Sr. ran it, and then later on probably for a little bit when Jr. was running things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering what the difference between the two company leaders were that you noticed.
Styles were very different. Remember that when I worked for the McMahons, Jr. was only about 6 years older than me. Like, I was in my mid-20s. He was like 31, and he was the commentator. And he was the boss's son. His father was much more reserved. Junior was always had an overblown ego, always. And, they were just two different people. I mean, just not any cleaner one than the other, or not any dirtier one than the other. It's just their styles were very different.
I see. And you also worked for the American Wrestling Association and Vern Gagne. Any overall thoughts on your time there?
Vern always treated me well. One of the reasons that I left the WWF at the time that I did, which was just about when Hulkamania was breaking out, is that I knew that he didn't have much of a future there. Vinny had his personnel in place. I was more of Gorilla Monsoon was a co-owner up till that time, so I worked mostly for Monsoon, and so when Monsoon lost his shares of the company, I knew I didn't have that future, and Vern Gagne was just starting AWA on ESPN. Now, at the time, that was incredible, that pro wrestling would be on a legitimate sports network. And he was taping his shows in Atlantic City, New Jersey, which was drivable for me, who I was still teaching school. So that was one of the reasons I left. He always treated me well, Vern Gagne did, then called me in to do a couple of his pay-per-views. I did Wrestle Rock, and I did Super Clash 3. As a result of appearing on his pay-per-view, I got a call from WCW because then I started also working for Jim Crockett Promotions when they were up in the Northeast and mostly in Baltimore and Philadelphia. And so when the company was sold to Turner Broadcasting, I sort of was a visible figure since I was a mainstay of the important shows that Jim Crockett Promotion produced. And when Jim Hurd saw me on an AWA pay-per-view, he sent a message to me that I couldn't continue to do their pay-per-views, that I was his ring announcer. Now, I wasn't under contract with these guys, so I just said to him, screw that, I'm not sitting home and turning down a payday. You need to guarantee me, you need to offer me a contract, and then I'll be, quote-unquote, your announcer. And that's how I got my contract in '89 with WCW.
How did
Vern
you
was
find?
very good to me, to answer your question. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. But how did you find Jim Herd? There's so many stories about him out there.
He was in over his head, and but yet, just picture somebody that's brash, braggadocious, is never going to admit it, but is in over his head. It's kind of like a guy that's drowning, and to try to overcompensate, he's like wailing away at the water. That's how I saw him. At the time, there was also a lot of suspicion that, and this has nothing to do with Herd, other than the fact he may have hired some former WWF people, and there was suspicion that we had traitors among us, because some of the decisions that were made were just so stupid that it would just set us up for failure. Like the arena booker, who used to be the assistant up in at Titan Towers. I mean, he would book us in Tennessee on a Wednesday night when everyone was in church. He booked us in San Antonio on Easter afternoon. San Antonio, the most Catholic city in the country at the time. You know what I'm saying? So, it was disheartening, because there was such great talent there, such great potential.
Didn't you also go to some bigger arenas too, when there was some other options in the town that probably would have been less expensive to rent?
Yeah, and this was all pre-Eric, before Eric took over, because then he brought in his own arena booker in, who also had worked with Vince, but was on Eric's team for sure. I think his name was Zane Bresloff, who did a great job for Eric.
Because I think outside of the Crockett territory, when WCW took over, unless it was a pay-per-view for the house shows, from what I understand, you guys weren't drawing huge numbers, and probably that could have been one of the reasons.
You know, and now you're Canada-based. I remember a tour up in Canada where I think it was supposed to be 3 or 4 shows. And one of the shows was the Lord Beaverbrook Rink in Ontario, I believe. I just don't remember exactly, where that was located. So we show up at the night before. We were in some kind of high school in, is it Kitchener?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that?
Yeah, it's all around the Toronto. Kitchener's around the Toronto area. It's maybe an hour and a half outside of Toronto.
And then the next night we were at the Lord Beaverbrook Rink. And so we show up, and there are police surrounding the building. And they tell me, you can't go in. I said, well, why not? We have a show here. And it was, we had a pretty good advance there. And through the night, somebody had undone the valve, and the building was filled with ammonia. Like it was a sabotage kind of deal. That's the kind of thing we would run into. So it was disheartening very often.
On the internet, it says that's in New Brunswick. Is it possible you guys could have gone to New Brunswick, Canada?
Yes, and then we drove. Would we have driven to Halifax?
Yes.
Through the mountains?
Yeah. That's interesting. I never heard that WCW ever toured here other than in Toronto, and I think there was a show in Manitoba in later years, but that's very interesting that you guys did the East Coast.
That would have been 89, 90.
Okay.
I also remember coming over, following a Detroit show, driving over the border. They had pared down, they had cordoned off an area of a huge arena I think it was in Toronto.
The Sky Dome, right? There was like Sting against Vader or something. It was just after WrestleMania 6.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
How did that one draw? Because I actually remember the publicity for that one. we used to have a show in Canada called the WCW Power Hour that you were the ring announcer for.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the publicity for that event. I think it was just after WrestleMania 6, but I never remember seeing any video footage of it, so I guess it was just a glorified house show.
Yeah, and then there were maybe a couple times when we played Buffalo, New York, and came over into Canada, just right over the border.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And finally, the last question I'll ask you, you've been giving us great answers so far, and we really appreciate your time. As you mentioned earlier in this interview that Bruno Sammartino played a vital part in your career, and of course, he lived a great life, and he passed away in his 80s recently. Just wondering if you'd like to share any memory of Bruno with us.
Well, in the current edition of my stage show, I paid tribute to Bruno. As a young boy, Bruno brought me to wrestling. Bruno was the reason I fell in love with wrestling, and then in years later, he became a friend. And often when that happens, when you get to know your hero, there is a certain letdown. With Bruno, he only became greater in my life and as a person. At my stage show, I showed a couple of short clips of his promos during his feud with Larry Zbyszko. And he always hit certain universal themes that everyone could connect with, being family and like a wholesome kind of loyalty because Larry had turned on him. And anyone who was watching this masterful performance couldn't help but get connected with Bruno. It was very sad because the first main event that I ever introduced 44 years ago was Bruno Sammartino versus Nikolai Volkov. And within 4 or 5 months of each other, they passed away. So it was especially sad, for me.
Yes, and we actually have used Nikolai in our company in the past, and we've interviewed him, and I actually just interviewed him this past June, and he was talking about his vegetarianism and how he was feeling great. And he was concerned in that interview about the Iron Sheik's health, so I was completely blown away when I heard that about Nikolai, unfortunately.
Yes, he was always a clean living kind of guy. He was always very realistic about his career. When he finished the height of his WWF years, he lived in the Baltimore area, and he got a position with the county of Baltimore, and he was an inspector, I think water, but an inspector of some kind. And what he essentially did was create a pension for himself and now for his family, for his wife. Like a really down-to-earth, smart guy. The funny part of Nikolai, but important, is you can set your watch on him. Like if you booked him and there was a huge ice storm in the area, you would just stand there and he just slowly would come driving through that ice storm, and he would be at that show on time. He was you could set your watch on him. He was dependable.
And that is rare from my experience as a promoter with some wrestlers.
And, I give you guys a lot of credit now that I'm promoting my stage shows. I love doing my stage shows. Promoting them, not so much. Like lining up the building, and if I'm going to have a guest that night, and being sure that the building's equipped with what I need, especially since 99% of the time I've never been to the building before the day of the show. So I just have to go by what I'm told by, like, theater owners, for instance. So, promoting is not easy.
So for people that want to find out more about your shows, do you have a website they can visit?
Yeah. Well, they can go to my Facebook page, which is my initials, GMC, number 4, real. My upcoming stage shows, I have 3 left this year. Chicago on September 21st, Pittsburgh October 6th, and Winston-Salem at WrestleCade on November 23rd. Tickets are at eventbrite.com. And for your listening audience, if they put the promo code in, my initials, GMC20, they'll get 20% off all tickets. So Chicago, Pittsburgh, Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
And your book is called Body Slams, Memoirs of a Wrestling Pitchman. Where can people find that?
Amazon is probably, or BarnesandNoble.com, or you can go to your local bookstore and order it. It's usually not on the shelves anymore.
Well, I'm definitely going to pick that up, and I hope one day to do a video interview with you. And we only just scratched the surface today, so I'll hope to have you on for another phone interview possibly in the future. And thank you very much. I was a big WCW fan, so to get to talk to you is a good pleasure for me, and I wish you the best of luck with your upcoming stage shows.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Great North Wrestling Podcast. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and subscribe to the Hannibal TV on YouTube for all the latest GNW news and videos. Follow at Devin Hannibal on Twitter and check out our website at thehannibaltv.com.